Thank you very much for the kind introductions. I'm indeed thrilled to be here and to present our project, which, as you know, is called Geographies of Dissociation. You also heard a few words about ourselves. So this is us. Oliver Ebert on the left, he's the principal investigator. Jana Kleibert and myself, we did the fieldwork. And we have external collaborators, Dominic Power from Stockholm University and Martin Hess from Manchester, who is also present here. We are funded by the Leibniz competition. So Leibniz Association is paying for this project, but also for this conference out of the budget of our project. Value. We're interested in value. And coming from our specific social science background, we think value is in the eye of the beholder. Specifically, value is in appreciation, value is in perception. Now, this is a point of view that can be disputed, but this is our starting point. And the idea goes on that value of a product rests on positive associations, things people associate with a commodity that link it to entities of value, such as origin, identity, authenticity, other things, even moral ideas. Such associations can be spatial, very often they are, as you can see in the example of the Made in Germany label, or the cognac, which actually can only come from this particular region. Associations are based on feelings, they're not logical, they're not rational, and decisively, sellers can try to actively create these associations if they manage to make them robust, to make them plausible or accessible, and to make them salient, to make them stick. But what about the things that maybe a producer wouldn't want you to see, or associations a producer wouldn't want you to have? And I would like to read a quote from a handbook on crisis management. In the old days, when the airlines were still trying to convince people of the safety of their planes, they would paint the airlines' names directly over the plane's doors. That way, when a photographer captured a movie star or politician disembarking from a plane, the name of the safely landed airline would be visible. But in the advent of a crash, the first job of the guy in the field was to rush out to the crash scene with a bucket of white paint and to obliterate the name of the airline before the photographers showed up. So this is quite a drastic case of something we call dissociation, making negative associations disappear. And we found that dissociation can either mean disrupting, actively, reactively disrupting or dissolving a negative association, a specific crisis, or an attack that was launched by another actor. Or dissociations can be proactive, kind of trying to look the other way, trying to make sure that a particular area stays in the dark, making sure that nobody ever would probably start to ask questions. And taking this perspective seriously, we think in research means that we are open about what is being made visible, what is being made invisible, what is highlighted and what is ignored, who is doing it, and for what benefit or purpose. This is the idea that guided our research. Now, we decided to look at the example of fur. Why? Traditionally, fur garments used to be craft-based. They used to have quite a strong and stable association with what they signified. They signified status, they signified gender difference, they signified power, wealth. But there's also quite a controversy about fur. There's a big controversy, strongly negative emotions. Still the positive associations with wealth and luxury remain, but there's a huge debate and a lot of negative feelings. So you could assume that there's probably a lot of association and dissociation going on in the case of fur. There's a discussion mainly focused on the animal usage aspect, but there are overtones of class conflict, gender, sexual politics. And this discussion, as heated as it is something we would not want to take a stance in. We will not take sides, but we find it very interesting how a product can survive under these circumstances. An additional benefit of fur, we thought, was that it is visible. We thought we could trace it, and there are specific places where you can observe how fur is valued, such as auctions or fur fairs. Fur has also experienced a crisis since the 80s and 90s, but it also has experienced a spectacular resurgence, which makes it all the more interesting. What we did was a lot of traveling. So we looked at sites globally, sites of fur production and raw fur trade, sites of intermediate trading of fur garments, and sites of consumption and retailing of fur garments. We, very early on, we hit a bump with representatives of the fur industry who didn't trust us very much, but later on it got a lot better, and actually a lot of actors in the fur trade were extremely helpful and welcoming to our research. So we conducted interviews, about 40 or 45 of them, depending how you count. We made observations, we took pictures and videos, we analyzed promotional material, and we looked at the online content, the arguments and the pictures that were presented by the actors that we met in the field. This is our data. And I would like to go through a number of key theses summing up what we think is going on in the case of fur in terms of association and dissociation, specifically what the value of the dissociation perspective is. Now, fur has been brought back into fashion dramatically, but also in a dramatically new form since the 90s. And our first thesis would be that during this reconnection between fur and fashion, this traditionally close link between the material and the meaning has been dissolved. So you could say that the first dissociation is that fur was dissociated from itself. The effect is that people can still oppose the fur industry, but accept all the fur that is out there. When I talk about the fur industry, and for the purpose of looking at this first thesis, we have to go to places like Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Montreal. And when I talk about the fur industry, I will mostly talk about fur breeders and their associations. Most fur today is farmed. The fur breeders have associations which are political and economic entities, and they are quite powerful. They are quite powerful because they run marketing organizations and they run auction houses through which they sell the furs. So they have quite a strong influence on the raw fur trade. And these actors, these breeders' associations, their auction houses and their marketing organizations are what I will refer to as the fur industry. These are organizations like Saga Furs of Finland and Copenhagen Fur of Denmark. These organizations have led the reconnection between fur and fashion, and they have done so by building design centers in places like Copenhagen. And these are very attractive, very interesting, welcoming places of encounter, where you can learn about fur, where you can be creative with fur. They have a big multitude of activities, and these include, for example, university collaboration, fostering the teaching of how to work with fur in universities and fashion design schools, sponsoring material to these schools, coaching new brands. This is probably, for many of the audience, a very interesting thing because it's difficult for a young designer to start their own brand. So there's coaching of new young brands which use fur, obviously. They help them get access to media, to fashion shows, help them write business plans, build a production chain, all these things that you need to know. There's a lot of co-branding with more mature brands. There's a lot of on-site teaching for designers and furriers. They supply samples to whoever needs them, all kinds of fur. And they catalog and disseminate styles, patterns, new techniques of what you can do with fur. And this includes mixing fur with other materials. It also includes changing fur in ways that it doesn't even look like fur anymore, using it in new colors, in new styles and new combinations. Under the pressures of this big change, traditional furriers have lost out, and there are very few of them left. But some have adapted, and they have become part of this new wave. So they have created lighter, more varied cuts, more colorful garments. They've adopted new techniques like plucking, shearing, perforation, all techniques which kind of make the material lighter, more accessible. They combine the material with wool, silk, leather, even non-animal materials. You can wear them inside out. The garments are more independent from the seasons. But still, if you go to a furrier's shop, and this is an image from a furrier's shop in Berlin, the key quality metric will still be the craft and the quality of the fur itself. So these people will go to the auction and they will bid on the best furs. But in the case of brand fashion, the case is quite different. Fur has migrated into mainstream and brand fashion. At least half of the global fur production is used in fashion, accessories, and garments that are not primarily fur garments. We didn't really find out who buys fur for whom, what the exact streams of the material are. This is almost impossible really to find out. But what we know is that these big fashion companies, these luxury brands, have a reputation for not buying the best furs. They have a reputation for buying lower quality fur because the quality of the fur itself is not the most important quality metric anymore. So big fashion companies send brokers to the auctions and they buy the fur. And I would just like to give you some examples of how the fur is used in constructing brand value. So on the very left you see a Burberry coat. Now Burberry is a brand that is known for the association with Britishness, for constructing an image of Britishness. And this brand is very strong in using classical styles and designs that are associated with being British. And they also use a lot of fur, but the fur is not actually actively narrated in some way. So what you see on the left is actually it's a rabbit fur coat that is made to look like leopard. So there's no way of actively telling the story of fur. And the other example is a Fendi bag. Fendi is also quite heavily using fur to making things more kind of fluffy and soft. But in this case, too, the fur isn't actively narrated. It adds to the value, it adds to the appeal, but nobody's actually talking about the fur. There are other examples. These are quite extreme examples here. There's an independent designer brand called Petit Mort from America. And the designer uses or collects dead animals from the streets that were run over by cars and uses that fur. And she actively tells that story of the accidental fur that can be found everywhere rather than breeding fur. So this is a way of actually constructing brand value, actively telling a story of fur. And Canada Goose, which you all know, constructs an image of Canadian identity, and very actively telling the story how they source the furs from Canadian, often indigenous fur trappers. These are extreme examples. In most cases, the way fur is used is quite inconspicuous in fashion, but still it is visible in some way, adding value to the products. So the second thesis we have is that with all the fur that's out there, the boundaries what is fur and what it can be are blurred. And that, interestingly, faux fur, artificial fur, is a very important element in this blurring. Short note on nomenclature, faux fur is a positive term. The fur industry would refer to this rather as plastic, fake fur, petroleum-based fur, so they would use other words, but I'm going to stick with faux fur. At first glance, you would think that the difference between real fur and faux fur really falls into the lines of the pro-fur, anti-fur controversy. And the fur industry will bring about arguments like faux fur is petroleum-based, it's not sustainable, while PETA, for example, would say faux fur is so much better than real fur because you don't have to kill animals. But at second glance, we realized that the appreciation of faux fur is actually mixed on both sides of this debate. And a lot of people, even in the anti-fur camp, think that faux fur is actually an endorsement of the fur look, that it's actually making fur more approachable. And this is a side we took. So there's a lot of media attention on mislabeled faux fur, real fur being sold as faux fur, but we think there's a much bigger thing here. So the fur look and feel is present everywhere as trimmings, for example. And there's faux fur out there, and there's real fur, and you can really see them in close proximity to each other. They are in the same shops, they're within the same brands, they're even on the same clothing rails. Usually there's a price differential between the two, but you can find real fur and artificial fur in all price ranges. And there are multiple interdependencies between the two. First of all, they are hard to distinguish in consumption. There is something we would call comfortable ignorance, because a lot of people think, oh, well, the big retailers, they're going fur-free anyway, so I don't really have to think about this. A lot of people we spoke to said, I never thought this could be a real animal on my jacket. But then at some point, people also experienced a quality difference, because there is one. And one story we heard, something that apparently happens regularly, is that people who get dissatisfied with their faux fur trimming go to a furrier and have it replaced with real fur. So there's an interdependency there. And finally, there's another kind of faux fur, and that is lamb fur, rabbit fur, fur coming from animals that are not primarily fur animals. That is also mixed into the whole deal. So we think there's really a blurring of the boundaries of fur going on, which you can understand as a dissociation in itself. Now, as I said, there are some brands that use fur, other brands that don't use fur. Some communicate this very actively. Brands claim distinctiveness. But what we found is that most brands create value in interaction with other brands. And in this case, the fur controversy actually creates value on a new level. And this may sound complicated, but let me go into some details. So let's look at consumption and the city. You can find fur brands, non-fur brands, actually vegan brands in vicinity to each other. You can find them in the same shopping malls, you can find them in the same shopping streets. These places, shopping malls, but also shopping streets, are curated spaces. So somebody makes this decision. It's a good idea to have some fur luxury brands, and it's a good idea also to have some ecologic, ethical, non-fur vegan brands in the mix. This goes on in the ownership structures of brands. So most big brands really are owned by big fashion companies. And they are in their portfolios. You can really understand these as portfolio companies. They always tend to have fur brands, non-fur brands, vegan brands in the mix in their portfolios. So whatever way the debate goes, on a higher level, economic value is being created no matter what. The fur controversy also creates value in a different way in fashion in general and in the fashion media. We found it very interesting to see how contested events like fashion weeks are. So after every fashion week, the International Fur Federation will come out and say, we saw fur on 80% of all catwalks, and clearly fur is big, and fur is in fashion. Whereas PETA will say, we absolutely saw a decline of fur, and nobody's using fur anymore, and there were a lot of protests, so you can clearly see that fur is going down. So fashion is part of this huge attention economy that focuses on things like fashion weeks, for example. Also fashion magazines, they reserve space for the debate itself, they reserve space for advertisements, obviously, and they celebrate both pro-fur, fur-using, anti-fur brands alike. They do not take a stance, but the controversy obviously creates attention, so it's a source of value in itself. Now, we've heard that recently Gucci and earlier Armani have moved away from fur. Some people think that this is a broader trend. We got the impression that these spectacular moves towards fur or from fur actually are a way of creating attention, and therefore in their own way, the going back and forth is a way of creating value. Looking on the anti-fur campaigning, there are some really interesting forms of creating value going on there as well. So Lush, the soap brand, a company that has nothing to do with fur or fashion, is creating reputational gains by positioning itself as anti-fur and by funding anti-fur campaigns. And this is an image from a Lush shop with a little table there and the message "Make Fur History." We found that pressure groups like PETA are also quite specialized, and you can understand them as brands as well. And they conduct a particular form of debate, and they attack fur in a particular way, and they do it very strategically. And that they are quite open that it is a strategic choice to attack fur. Obviously, as animal rights groups, they have a broader agenda. They want to end all animal use. But fur is a good target, which they openly communicate. It's very visual, and it's easier to be against fur than it is to be against, for example, leather or meat. And so this, I think, is another way of creating continuous value in the controversy or through the controversy. But where does fur actually come from? I haven't really talked about the origin of fur, and I would say that the origin of fur is also a case of dissociation involving geographical divisions of labor as well as spatial imaginations. But it's different than we thought in the beginning. So I would like to start with the picture on the right. This is from an anti-fur protest in Hong Kong, and you can see an activist dressed up as a skinned animal. So this is really the image against which the fur industry is fighting, this image of dead skinned animal bodies being discarded, being burned, not being actually used for food. This is one of their key messages. Eating meat may be bad, but it's still better than killing animals for the luxury only. This is why fur is particularly bad. There are also these videos that show fur animals being insufficiently stunned and then basically being skinned alive or even conscious. So there's the message that fur is particularly cruel, more cruel than other forms of animal use. And this is the negative association against which the fur industry is fighting. They can't just say, well, we're basically like every other animal-based industry like chicken. No, they have to fight against this specific accusation. And they've done so in creating a counter-image of fur as a green, responsible industry. So let's look about that in detail. So there's a circulating narrative that you will basically find everywhere, even on the websites of individual furriers. It's about fur being natural. That's a message that you also get in terms of wool or leather. It's durable and therefore sustainable. It's ecologically sensible, for example, to hunt animals, fur animals for population control, or fur farms are very well embedded in circuits of matter, of agricultural matter. For example, waste meat is being used for feed. There's traceability. We are transparent. In fact, there's a lot of traceability between the farm and the auction house, but not beyond that. It's biodegradable, unlike faux fur. And there's a big commitment to animal welfare, actually. And there's another narrative here. Basically, the narrative goes that fur animals are so special and so sensitive that you can't actually misuse them without being economically punished. Because when you misuse them, they will not grow, they will not give good fur, and therefore there's sort of like an automatic punishment cycle which forces fur farmers to treat their animals really well. And an important, I can't go into the details of what happens on a farm, but it's interesting to note that basically every single process on a fur farm, every way of describing this, the words that are used, depending on the side that you're on, the words are being turned and minced and directed in ways that either make it appear as something great or as something horrible. This is really interesting and would basically be its own project. One of the key messages from the fur industry is that fur breeding takes place in a regulated, high standards space. To be sure, there is no central regulation of fur. Animal welfare regulation is usually a national matter. There's an international trade ban on the furs of endangered species. Some territories ban the import of particular kinds of fur, and a lot of countries have banned fur farming either outright or for some species. Interestingly, the world market leader in mink farming, Denmark, has banned fox farming for reasons of animal welfare. How does this go? The construction of a regulated high standard space, a positive space. So the fur industry tried to position the brand or the label Origin Assured, which was meant to signify that the fur was coming from a farm in a country that has animal welfare standards. But it was never sure how this was going to be enforced, and the anti-fur activists were quite quick in turning the label around into cruelty assured, providing video footage from farms within the Origin Assured area that didn't look like the animals were treated very well. So they probably in response to this, but probably also preventing future regulation, the fur industry went ahead and came up with the Fur system, which is a point-based, expert-led system of animal welfare assessment in the fur industry in analogy to other comparable animal welfare assessment systems in Europe. So it's meant to be applied on a European level. And it's really mostly championed by Danish organizations and Danish scientists. So I am not sure, and nobody can be sure, whether this system actually means that everything will be fine within the territory where the welfare system applies. But it's interesting to note that this is the way they construct a positive, a high standard, high regulation space. And the question is, where does all the bad stuff happen? And the answer to that is it happens outside this positive, high standards space. And what does outside mean? In many cases, this means either explicitly or implicitly China. So the question is, what is the role of China in the whole thing? The streams you can see here are the international trade streams of raw furs. So after the auction, and you can see that there's a big, big arrow coming from Denmark to China. So this is really the biggest stream. This is actually mink fur, but mink is really the largest proportion of furs traded internationally. So the raw fur goes to China, which is today the most important luxury market. What you can see on the other picture is this big stream of finished fur garments going from China into Russia. So that is the biggest market for finished fur garments, at least in terms of international trade. What you don't see here is, firstly, the domestic production of furs in China, which is then going into fur products, which are then either exported to other countries or consumed in China. Specifically, fashion garments that contain fur but are not in themselves fur garments, because these don't show up in international trade statistics. So you don't see the domestic production, you don't see the domestic consumption of China, and you don't see the production of fur-containing garments and where they go. And this is really an interesting piece of dissociation, because due to its size, its huge size, you don't really see what's going on within China in terms of fur garment production. So what's the role of China? Well, as I said, it's now the leading end-user market for these luxury goods. It's increasingly influential in terms of design. It is the world's leading garment production country that goes for garments as a whole, but also garments containing fur. And what is the interesting point for us here is that China is being strawmanned as the bad guy in the fur trade. So a lot of people we talk to said, oh, we don't use furs from China, or people don't want furs from China. No, we want to be ethical, we want to be responsible, we're not using furs from China. So it's actually quite convenient to have China as a bad guy, because it's a spatial representation of what is considered a high-value space and a low-value space. As I said, the actual production figures are a bit unclear. There's a lot of informal trade. There are no central auction houses like in Denmark here, but there's a system of informal links and networks and markets. So the fur can go from the fur farm into the garment without it being very visible. The fella you see on the bottom right is a raccoon dog, which is the animal you will have on your trimming. The narrative by Western fur producers is that China is not successful in terms of fur production because it has low standards. What they fail to admit is that you can actually be quite successful and quite competitive in low-price fur. Coming to the last thesis, one thing that is important is that the marriage of fur and fashion has created multiple sustainability problems, and there's a strategic interest in maintaining this intransparency or opacity. So the first thing really is that there's a big conflict between the claim of durability and sustainability on the one hand, and the fact that fur has now become part of fast fashion, which means a lot of waste, short fashion cycles, and other kinds of ecological and ethical problems associated with the fashion industry as a whole. Point two, fur garments, fur to be used in garments needs to be made durable, it needs to be dyed, it needs to be dressed, it needs to be colored. And these are very problematic processes involving highly toxic chemicals, You can do this ecologically correctly, but it's expensive. And what we could find out from expert interviews is that these things really happen in low standard, cheap production countries, and that nobody wants to talk about these things. And it's actually very, very difficult to find out things about this. So this is, if we were to start now, maybe this would be the biggest dissociation to work on. So what's the value of the dissociation perspective? So one thing that we really find valuable is that it has brought us this paradox of visibility and invisibility of fur. The ambivalence of faux fur, we really hadn't thought about this beforehand. We found that the claim of distinctiveness of brands was disenchanted partially. We found that there's actually economic value in keeping up this emotional confrontation, which really focuses only on one aspect. We found it interesting that there's a surprisingly multifaceted role of China vis-a-vis Western fur producers, and there is a degree of strategic ignorance with regard to the issues that are outside the main focus of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I would have one question, and I was wondering about the value chain and about like power structures and dependencies in the value chain. Is it really that all the trade of the fur and the relationships between producers and buyers are auction-based, like a market arm's length thing, or are there also rather more like relationships of suppliers and brands? Like especially some brands, don't they have special farms from where they source, or is it all just through auctions?
The bulk, really, most of it is through auctions. What we don't really know is the scale of the more informal market. As I said, there's a more informal market in China, for example, and it's difficult to assess that. But really the biggest part of global fur production and trade goes via auctions. That being said, there are some brands who actively market the notion that they get the fur from particular sources, like Canada Goose from Canadian trappers. But I would say that the auction model really is the majority of the cases.
Thank you once more, Felix.
Thank you.